Hello everyone, this is Tim, once again coming to you from my makeshift basement workspace. For this lesson, I like to go over some what I believe to be some of the more important amendments in the Constitution. So remember, an amendment is an addition onto the Constitution. The first 10 are known as the Bill of Rights. Um, there are obviously a lot more than six. These are just the six that I find to be the most important in terms of how our nation was shaped historically to become what we are today. So these six I have them written down right here, but I'm going to go over them in a little more detail. So the first three are right in a row, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, and these came as almost a direct result of the Union Army win during the Civil War. They abolished slavery. They allowed everyone, well in this case, every male or everyone the right to be a citizen, and also said that the right to vote cannot be denied because of race. So those are the three that came as a direct result of the Civil War. The 19th Amendment also refers to voting, but this also gives everyone the right to vote regardless of their gender. So this dealt pretty much specifically for women. Women were not allowed the right to vote up to this point. The 22nd Amendment, which came after World War II, said that no president could be elected more than twice. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which was the president during the time of World War II, actually ran and won election 4 times. And the 26th Amendment gave anyone who was a citizen the right to vote as long as they were 18 years or older. So those are the six I'd like to go over. And I'm going to start with the first three there, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The 13th Amendment was ratified in 1865, and it basically abolished slavery or any sort of involuntary servitude, with the exception of if you were as some sort of a punishment, so like you're in prison or something like that. It is one of the first, if not the first, mention of slavery in the Constitution, and it also gave Congress the authority to also enforce it. So there's a common mistake that a lot of people believe that the Emancipation Proclamation, an order from Abraham Lincoln in 1863, freed slaves. That's not 100% true. The Emancipation Proclamation actually only freed slaves that were in the Confederate, the southern states. This was done for one big reason, and that was while most of the Union northern states had already basically done away with slavery, there were still a few in the Union states that allowed it. Most of those states bordered Washington, D.C., which were, again, our nation's capital. So Abraham Lincoln was a little concerned that if he abolished slavery throughout the entire nation, that these states would eventually go over to the other side, the Confederate side, and that would effectively cut off Washington, D.C. from the rest of the Union side. So it only freed slaves in the Confederate states. This introduces another issue. Technically, the Confederacy, the Confederate States, consider themselves almost like a separate country from the rest of the United States. So in their eyes, legally, Lincoln couldn't really do this. It would be the same as if Lincoln tried to make a rule for Canada. It wouldn't work. So in the grand scheme of things, it probably didn't really do a whole lot. It definitely was a big step forward. It put slavery almost at like the forefront, or one of the forefronts of the war. It was kind of an underlying issue, and now it became a big issue. But the 13th Amendment is actually the one that abolished slavery. So that's a very big one. So no more slavery in the United States. And again, that was ratified in 1865. So 3 years later, in 1868, they ratified the 14th Amendment. And this said that everybody has the right to be a citizen and forbade racial discrimination. It wasn't super specific as to what qualified as racial discrimination, but it was there. It also made it so that states and local governments could not deny any person the right to life, liberty, property without due process of the law. So that phrase sounds familiar. That is because it was also mentioned in the Fifth Amendment. However, the Fifth Amendment only applied to federal laws, federal legislation. Now, with the passing of the 14th Amendment, all levels of government could no longer deny anyone the right to life, liberty, and property without due process. You had the Equal Protection Clause, which again forbade, was supposed to stop discrimination against African Americans. Again, the wording was very broad, the wording was very vague. So, as you can imagine, a lot of these Confederate or Southern states kind of found ways to make the lives of the African Americans more difficult. For example, in 1896, the Supreme Court passed or ruled on what's the Plessy versus Ferguson case, which basically said that as long as facilities were equal, you could have separate facilities for African Americans and for whites. So there's a water fountain for African American people, and there's a water fountain for white people. As you can imagine, these facilities were not often equal. Usually, the African American facilities were far inferior to the white facilities. And in terms of who was trying to determine whether or not they're equal or not, it was very loosely enforced. It was almost virtually ignored in the southern states. This ruling would not be overturned until 1954 in the Brown versus Board of Education, in which the Supreme Court allowed an African American girl to attend what was previously an all-white school. Now, the original purpose of the 14th Amendment was to protect African Americans. More contemporary viewpoints have expanded that to all races, not just African Americans. Again, this was a tricky one because it didn't give Congress the power to create new rules or expand on already existing ones. It only allowed them to regulate codes and rules that were already in existence. It did give them the power to regulate state and local government conduct, not private, but state and local government conduct. But again, they couldn't do anything new. They had to work with what they were already given, which again handcuffed them significantly. The 15th Amendment, which was another 2 years after that, in 1870, gave the right to vote to everyone. So you could not be denied the right to vote because of your race. At this particular time, it really was considered only referring to males. Women would not receive the right to vote for another 50 years, which is actually going to be our next one. But again, like with the 15th or with the 14th Amendment, a lot of southern states found ways to make lives more difficult for African Americans, and by extension, some poor white citizens as well. So by 1890, a lot of southern states adopted laws that again would make it difficult for someone who wasn't well-off white person to vote. They instituted literacy tests, so reading tests, in order to be able to vote. They instituted poll taxes; you had to pay a tax to vote. So a lot of these previous slaves, these African Americans, were not working, did not make a lot of money, and a lot of them couldn't read. So obviously you can see would that be an issue. But again, a lot of poor whites were also very poor, didn't have a great education, were also being denied the right to vote because of these laws. Unfortunately, this would not be overturned for about another 100 years. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act passed by Lyndon B. Johnson banned literacy tests. In 1964, the year before that, poll taxes on federal elections, so for president, Congress, etc., were banned. By 1966, state poll taxes were also banned. So by 1966, federal and state poll taxes were banned, as well as literacy tests. At first, these were loosely enforced, but they picked up steam, and again, we have our election system we have today. So the 15th Amendment again gave everyone who was a citizen the right to vote, and you could not be denied due to race. Now again, this is mainly seen as pertaining towards men. Women, again, would not receive the right to vote for another 50 years in 1920. So in 1920, the 19th Amendment was passed, and that gave the right to vote to everyone, and you couldn't be denied because of gender. Um, so a lot of steam started picking up for this amendment at least this right to vote for women in 1848 with the Seneca Falls Convention, not really that far from here in Onondaga County. It was the first women's rights convention. Um, some women tried to argue that the 14th Amendment gave them the right to vote. One of the most famously women is Susan B. Anthony. And she actually did go ahead and vote under that premise. Now, she was arrested 2 weeks later for voting illegally, but she did vote at first, and unfortunately for her, was arrested afterwards. Now, this gave them the notion that they couldn't just do it they couldn't get the right to vote based off what was already the rules that were already there. They had to come up with their own laws. In 1874, the Supreme Court ruled that citizenship did not necessarily guarantee the right to vote, and again, this was mainly geared towards women. The ratification of this amendment was very difficult. Tennessee was the state that kind of put it over the top for the victory to allow this amendment to go through. And actually, there's a funny story for that. The deciding vote was a 24-year-old gentleman by the name of Harry Burns, and he actually was originally going to vote against the amendment, but his mother got a hold of him and told him to do the right thing. So he went ahead and voted for the amendment. So you can thank Harry Burns' mother for women having the right to vote in 1920. So again, at this point, African Americans and women have now been given the right to vote as long as they were a citizen. So we're going to move on from the notion of voting in getting to the 22nd Amendment, which came about 30 years after the 19th Amendment. So at this time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the president. He was a president towards the middle end of the Great Depression and was the president throughout most of World War II. Now, before this, there was no actual term limits written in the Constitution. The Founding Fathers discussed it. They decided to ultimately leave it off. However, George Washington, obviously our first president, only ran twice. And this was an unofficial precedent that lasted about 150 years until FDR decided to run for a third and fourth term. During wartime, because the United States needed a strong leader and didn't really want to be switching gears about halfway through, people were okay with this. But after World War II, this was very alarming for a lot of individuals, particularly Republicans and also some Democrats that were a little more conservative. So they wanted a term limit, and that's where the 22nd Amendment came from. So you can thank Franklin Delano Roosevelt for that one. The last one I discuss is the 26th Amendment. This came again about 20 years after the 22nd Amendment, and actually this reverts back to a voting issue. This was ratified in 1971, and again gave everyone who is a citizen and over the ages of 18 the right to vote. Before this time, the 14th Amendment said that you had to be 21 or older to vote. So the 26th Amendment dropped that down 3 years. Technically speaking, states were allowed to lower, up to this point, they were allowed to lower the age limit for voting. A lot of them didn't, though. However, during this time period, we have the Vietnam War going on. And a lot of young men that were going to fight in the war were between the ages of 18 and 20. So this put a lot of pressure on Congress to pass this ruling, because a lot of these guys were going off and fighting and dying for their country, but they couldn't have the right to vote. Interestingly enough, this does not protect any other rights other than voting. It's just referring strictly to voting. However, again, it does give us the ruling that we have today, where if you're 18 or older, you can vote as long as you're a citizen. So those are the 6 amendments that I find to be some of the important ones in, again, our history. It kind of shapes our nation. It kind of gives us what we have today. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it helped you out a little bit. And I will see you for the next one.